Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into something fundamental. It's about India's changing role in this, well, incredibly complex and shifting global landscape.
Definitely. A multipolar world, as they say.
Exactly. And we're going to explore how India is trying to navigate some major geopolitical hotspots, like the war in Ukraine, and also these shifting alliances that are basically redrawing the map of international relations.
It's a critical time for these kinds of shifts.
It really is.
Yeah.
So the big question we're trying to tackle today is, well, how is India actually putting together new diplomatic strategies? And maybe more importantly, what does this mean? Not just for India, obviously, but for global peace, for trade, for all of us, really.
It's a huge question.
Right.
And the sources we're digging into today offer a very timely and I'd say pretty provocative look at foreign policy, trade, and just the raw nature of power dynamics here in the 21st century.
Provocatives in what way?
Well, they really challenge some standard ideas. They offer this compelling perspective on India's potential, its growing ability maybe to redefine global norms. But they also don't pull any punches about challenges.
Like what?
Challenges within the current system, the limits of old ways of dealing with conflict. And interestingly, how a country's own internal politics, its domestic structures, can actually cast a really long shadow on how it acts internationally.
That's fascinating. So what are the sources?
Right. Primarily, we're drawing from recent analytical pieces on the Barack Face blog. Some specific titles are India in a Multipolar World. It's time to play and, not or, India's Ukraine Moment. Why Modi must step off the sidelines and into history. Another one called My Formula for Ukraine Peace is Better Than Talking is Better Than Shooting. Why the Trump-Putin meeting matters. And finally, the problem with American sanctions. When 1% rules the world. Quite a range.
Wow. Okay. A lot to unpack there. So our mission today, for you listening, is to break down these sources. We want to pull out the key insights, the really important stuff, and help you grasp the nuances here.
Nuances like India's strategic position, yeah.
Exactly. And the limitations, maybe, of how we usually approach conflict. And this intriguing link between domestic politics and global affairs. This isn't just about, skimming headlines.
No, definitely not. It's about the deeper currents, the forces really shaping things.
Right. Giving you that shortcut to being genuinely informed. So let's dive in. Where do we start? Maybe with this whole idea of multipolarity.
Sounds good. Let's kick off there.
Okay, so for, decades, right? Especially during the Cold War, the big question for countries like India was always sort of binary.
Always black and white, yeah.
Yeah. Strategists, policymakers, they were constantly asking, should India ally with the U.S. or maybe with China or with Russia? It was always framed as an either choice.
Which force nations into these really rigid boxes, these blocks?
Totally. But the sources we're looking at today basically say that question. It's not just old news, it's like completely irrelevant now.
Obsolete is the word they use, I think.
Obsolete, because the 21st century, it's not bipolar. It's genuinely multipolar. And here's the kicker. India isn't just some large country watching this happen.
No, it's one of the poles, unequivocally. That's the core argument.
That's a huge shift in thinking.
It is. And what's really interesting is how this change, from two main powers to many, fundamentally alters the game for countries like India.
How so? Like thinking back to the Cold War.
Well, India famously chose non-alignment, right? It was a leader in the non-aligned movement, NAM.
Right. Which sometimes got criticized, didn't it, for being maybe a bit passive?
It did, sometimes. But the sources argue that its core idea asserting independence from the big superpowers, especially for smaller and medium countries, that idea is actually incredibly relevant again today. Profoundly relevant.
But it's different now for India.
Very different, because India isn't just asking for autonomy from the sidelines anymore. It's grown into a major player itself, a real center of gravity in a world that now has many centers. So it's not just like dusting off old non-alignment.
It's an evolution.
Exactly, a dynamic evolution. It allows for a much more flexible, proactive, and frankly self-interested foreign policy. The key word isn't or anymore, it's and.
Okay, so and. What does that really mean, though, being a pole in this new system? It sounds like more than just having a big economy or army.
Oh, much more. It implies real diplomatic agency, the ability to actually shape global norms, not just react to them. And it means actively building and keeping deep ties with pretty much everyone who matters.
All at the same time.
Yes, the sources are super direct about this. They say, and I'm quoting loosely here, the choice is no longer either. The strategic imperative is and. India should maintain deep relationships with the US, China, and Russia simultaneously.
Wow.
Yeah.
So forget picking sides in some big ideological fight.
Right. It's about connecting with all sides strategically, finding overlapping interests, and using that whole network to boost your own influence and security. It's a totally different way of thinking about power today.
A paradigm shift, really.
Absolutely. And this "and" approach, it doesn't just stop with the big three, the US, China, Russia.
Okay.
What's really insightful in the sources is the argument that India's strategy needs to also include building really strong trade and diplomatic links with what they call the 100 smallest economies by GDP.
The 100 smallest. That seems
Yeah.
counterintuitive. Individually, they don't seem that significant on the world stage.
Individually, maybe not. You might easily dismiss them if you're just looking at like raw GDP numbers. But think about it collectively.
Okay.
Together, they represent hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
They often have significant resources, maybe undeveloped, but there.
Yeah.
And crucially, in places like the UN, they represent vital voting blocs.
Ah, the voting power.
Right. Ignoring them, the sources argue, would be a massive strategic mistake.
Okay, that makes sense. So why is overlooking these smaller nations such a big error, strategically speaking?
Because their collective weight, which often gets ignored, can actually be, well, economically significant in aggregate and politically very influential, especially in forums like the UN General Assembly, where it's one country, one vote.
All right.
And for India, this isn't about, some kind of charity or moral grandstanding. It's presented as a really pragmatic, strategic move, especially given India's history with NMA and its ambition to be a leader for the global South.
So it builds on that history.
Precisely. The sources put it quite pointedly, asking this rhetorical question. If India, the world's largest democracy and a rising economic giant, won't take a proactive role in shaping global trade norms, will Lesotho, will Belize.
Sure point. It's basically saying step up.
Exactly. It's a challenge for India to fill a leadership gap. They stress India's unique position to bridge different worlds, quoting again from the G7 to the G77, from Washington to Windhoek, connecting the big developed economies with the huge block of developing nations.
So this isn't just about India's benefit. It's about broader global structures.
It is. This kind of outreach builds India's economic resilience, makes it less dependent on any one partner, and it boosts its diplomatic leverage everywhere, way more than just focusing on the US or China ever could.
This idea of connecting with the G77, the global South, it makes you wonder about the potential, right? Could India lead a sort of new coalition?
That's a really fascinating question the sources raise. What if India could actually forge a more cohesive global South bloc built on these ties with smaller economies?
What would that look like?
Well, acting together, such a group could seriously shift power dynamics in international bodies, maybe even challenge the dominance of, say, the traditional Western-led institutions.
Or maybe set new rules.
Potentially.
Why is that?
Establish new, maybe fairer trade norms, or create different frameworks for cooperation focusing more on development, sustainability, things that matter to them, rather than just the security or economic interests of the big powers.
It's about using collective clout where individual power is limited. A totally different model from the last century.
Exactly. A different paradigm.
Okay, so India is building these new connections, this and strategy, but at the same time, it's existing tensions, right? Especially with established powers like the U.S.
Yes, and the sources really push back against a common narrative here.
Which is?
The idea that current U.S. tariff threats towards India are just about, say, personal friction with a particular president or administration.
You mean like Trump's trade policies?
That's often how it's portrayed, but the sources argue it's much deeper, more structural than that. They say it's fundamentally driven by powerful domestic corporate lobbies inside the U.S.
Lobbies. Which ones?
They specifically call out big agriculture and big pharma, so it's less about presidential whims and more about these deep-seated internal economic battles playing out.
That's a really crucial distinction. So it's internal U.S. dynamics driving friction with allies.
That's the argument. And understanding this is key because it reveals this often hidden struggle within the U.S. political system. The sources have this line where agriculture lobbies lead, pharmaceutical lobbies often follow.
What does it mean exactly?
It paints a picture of these powerful domestic groups fighting over very specific things. It's not abstract stuff. It's about, say, U.S. tariffs on imported Indian soybeans or rice. That's big ag.
Right.
And then Big Pharma sees an opening or maybe feels emboldened and pushes harder to protect its global patent rules for expensive life-saving drugs. It's like a domino effect, driven by internal U.S. politics and economics.
Wow. So if these tensions are really rooted in these internal U.S. fault lines, what does that mean for India's foreign policy? How should it respond?
It suggests that a really subtle approach is needed. Understanding these internal divisions within your counterpart, like the U.S., allows for a much more effective strategy than just, say, retaliating with tariffs.
How so? More effective.
The sources suggest it lets India, and I quote, position itself to extract better terms without firing a shot economically or diplomatically.
Without firing a shot, how?
The recommended tactic, the subtlety they mention, isn't direct confrontation. It's about, well, letting these powerful interests inside the U.S. kind of neutralize each other.
Like, let them fight it out.
Exactly. Let U.S. Big Pharma and U.S. Big Ag battle it out on Capitol Hill. That's the quote. It's a clever way for India to advance its interests by, essentially, leveraging the internal contradictions of its partners.
That's quite sophisticated. A form of soft power, almost.
You could see it that way. And this nuanced approach to trade, it's not just a one-off tactic. It's presented as a core part of what the sources call India's multipolar method.
Okay, the multipolar method. That sounds important. What are the guiding principles here?
They lay out three key ones. Think of it as India's blueprint for this new era.
All right, let's unpack these three principles. They sound central to this whole strategy. What's the first one?
First, trade with everyone. And they mean everyone.
More than just the big guys like the US, EU, ASEAN, and...
Much more. The sources specifically say India should deepen ties with Africa's emerging consumer markets, Latin America's resource-rich economies, and the island states that control vast, exclusive economic zones. It's about casting a really wide net.
And the benefit isn't just economic growth.
Growth is part of it, sure, but maybe more importantly, this kind of radical diversification makes India much more resilient economically. It's less vulnerable if one big partner tries to exert pressure or impose sanctions.
Right, you're not overly dependent.
Exactly. And diplomatically, it gives India reach and influence in regions where maybe it didn't have much before. It expands the toolkit significantly.
Okay, trade with everyone. What's principle number 2?
Number 2 is leverage multipolarity to avoid entrapment.
Avoid entrapment, meaning...
Meaning maintain strategic autonomy. It's about flexibility. Building partnerships based on specific issues, specific shared interests, rather than getting locked into rigid Cold War-style blocks.
So ad hoc coalitions almost.
Right.
Partnering with different countries on different issues.
Precisely. It allows India to pick and choose its partners depending on the situation, maximizing its own benefit and minimizing the risk of getting dragged into conflicts or commitments that don't serve its core interests. In a world with many power centers, being flexible like that is a huge advantage.
Makes sense. And the third principle. You mentioned exploiting contradictions earlier.
Yes, that's the third one. Exploit external contradictions. This is maybe the most intriguing one.
How does it work in practice?
It means really understanding the domestic political divides within other major countries, like those U.S. lobbies we talked about, and then tactically engaging with those divides.
So, using their internal politics to your advantage.
In a subtle way, yes. It's framed as a potent form of soft power, advancing your interests without needing direct confrontation. You're essentially letting the internal tensions in another country do some of the diplomatic work for you.
Can you give an example?
Well, say a major power is fiercely debating its climate policy internally. India might subtly align itself with the pro-renewable energy faction within that country that indirectly helps India's own green industries and its global climate goals, but without causing direct friction with that country's government as a whole.
Clever. So this multipolar method, trade everywhere, stay flexible, use internal dynamics. It's a proactive strategy, not just reacting.
Definitely proactive. It's a blueprint for navigating this messy world without falling back into those old either traps.
But this strategy leveraging contradictions, it sounds like it could be risky too, right? You could be seen as meddling.
Absolutely. That's a potential pitfall. It requires really sophisticated diplomacy, a deep, real-time understanding of other countries' internal politics. Get it wrong, and you could easily erode trust instead of building it.
So it's not easy.
No. The sources stress that multipolarity isn't something that just happens automatically. It needs active, skillful management. And that's where India's responsibility comes in, especially with huge global challenges like the war in Ukraine.
Right, Ukraine. Let's shift focus there.
Yeah.
This seems like a major test case for India's role in this multipolar approach. How do the sources view the situation?
They argue very strongly, and this is a central point, that the idea of a purely military solution in Ukraine is basically An illusion, a military mirage, as they put it.
A mirage, meaning?
Meaning that just pouring more weapons into Kyiv indefinitely or trying to crush Russia with extreme sanctions simply isn't going to lead to a decisive military victory for either side. They see it as a strategic dead end.
Why not? What's the barrier?
The core issue they highlight is the hard reality of Russia's capabilities. Russia still has vastly more destructive weapons it hasn't even used yet, including, crucially, its massive nuclear arsenal. That nuclear deterrent fundamentally changes the whole equation of conventional war.
So escalation is too dangerous.
Exactly. And look at the reality on the ground. The sources point out that despite horrific losses on both sides over, 2.5 years now, the front lines have barely moved. It's a brutal stalemate.
A strategic stalemate, they call it. What'd that imply?
It implies neither side can achieve its full objectives militarily without taking absolutely unacceptable risks. Ukraine, even with Western help, probably can't reclaim all its territory by force alone without devastating cost. And Russia can't fully conquer Ukraine without risking massive escalation, internal instability, or a wider war.
So pushing for a purely military win is chasing an illusion.
That's the argument. And it implies that continuing these military-first strategies just prolongs the suffering and instability without a realistic path to ending the conflict decisively.
Okay, if the military path is a dead end, what does that say about the current strategies of, say, Western powers heavily backing Ukraine militarily?
It suggests, perhaps controversially, that while their intention is to support Ukraine's sovereignty, the approach might be unintentionally locking things into a protracted conflict with no clear military endgame.
And the consequences.
The sources warn about a perpetually wounded Ukraine, ongoing global instability, and maybe even Russia digging in deeper, becoming more authoritarian. It's a pretty bleak assessment if things continue on the current track. It demands a rethink.
And this ties into sanctions too, right? They're often linked to the military goals.
Directly linked. And the sources are equally critical of the effectiveness of sanctions, especially when they're designed to force a military outcome.
How so? They're not working.
The argument is no, not in the way intended. They cite extreme examples, like the floated idea of 500% secondary tariffs on countries like India and China if they buy Russian oil. The sources say these kinds of measures are failing.
Failing how? The Russian economy hasn't collapsed.
Far from it. It's shown surprising resilience. It adapted. It rerouted oil to new buyers, often India and China, actually. It stabilized the ruble. And critically, its war production is apparently back up to Cold War levels. The economic knockout blow just didn't happen.
Wow, 500% tariffs. That sounds extreme. What would the impact of something like that actually be?
Catastrophic, according to the sources. They spell it out. It would essentially end U.S. trade with the world's two largest developing economies, India and China.
End trade. That's huge. What's the scale?
Together, India and China are over 36% of the world's population and nearly a quarter of global GDP, especially if you measure by purchasing power parity, PPP, which gives a better sense of real economic size.
So the practical effects in the U.S.
The sources paint a vivid picture. Empty Walmart shelves, empty Walgreens shelves, and an immediate supply chain shock in everything from pharmaceuticals to electronics, basically economic chaos.
So the threat is incredible.
They call it a diplomatic bluff so transparent that all parties can see through it. And when your bluff is called or everyone knows it's a bluff,
You lose credibility.
exactly, you can't effectively negotiate or coerce if your threats are seen as empty.
And how do these kinds of sanctions backfire beyond just credibility? Do they push countries away?
That's a key point. The sources argue it pushes nations like India and China, who are crucial global players, further into Moscow's economic orbit. It actually weakens U.S. leverage, not just with them, but across the global south.
How did that work?
Because punishing them for buying Russian oil won't make Russia give up. What it will do is create deep resentment and actively encourage these massive economies to find alternatives to dealing with the West. It's described as strategic self-harm dressed up as resolve.
Strategic self-harm.
Yeah. It ignores how interconnected the world is now, ignores that multipolar reality we talked about. Plus, it pushes countries to find ways around the U.S. dollar, de-dollarization efforts. If the system can be weaponized against you, you'll look for alternatives.
Which could eventually weaken the dollar's dominance and fragment global trade.
That's the long-term risk they highlight, a significant cost to U.S. influence down the road.
Okay, so if military options are a mirage and sanctions are self-harm, what's the alternative? Where do we go from here, according to these sources?
They point strongly towards a political settlement. And this is where India comes back into the picture, potentially playing a absolutely crucial role.
Why India specifically?
Because India, they argue, has this truly unique geopolitical position. It has credibility in Kyiv, but it also has genuine warmth and deep ties with Moscow. A friendship built over decades of trust, military cooperation, strategic partnership.
So Moscow listens to New Delhi.
In a way, it just doesn't listen to Washington or Brussels or even Beijing, the sources contend. That long history gives India a unique channel, a unique leverage.
And Kiev, how do they see India?
Kyiv is understandably cautious about Western powers sometimes, wanting to maintain its own agency. But it seems to view India as a non-threatening, maybe more impartial voice from the global south.
So India has this unique bridge position, but is it using it?
The sources argue, not really, not yet. They say this invaluable leverage is being wasted by just repeating safe phrases like "we support peace," without putting forward a concrete plan, without taking diplomatic risks.
They mentioned past U.S. tariff threats
Yeah.
against India in this context, right? Like Trump's 25% threat.
Yes, and they frame it interestingly, not just as an economic threat, but as a shot across the bow, a signal of frustration that New Delhi is ducking the hard work of peacemaking.
Wow. So other powers expect India to step up.
That's the implication. The sources are quite forceful here, saying things like, emerging powers don't wait for permission slips. They move, they lead, they take risks.
They're calling this India's Ukraine moment.
Exactly. A defining chance for India to really act like the major power it is becoming. The question is whether it will seize this moment or let it slip by. It's about wielding power constructively.
Okay, so if India were to step up, what would that actually look like? Do the sources offer a specific plan, a playbook?
They do a pretty detailed 4-step playbook for how India could proactively engage.
All right, a 4-step playbook. Let's break it down. What's step 1?
Step 1. India should actively push Ukraine towards a security framework that is outside of NATO, but still provides strong guarantees for Ukraine's sovereignty.
Outside NATO. Why is that specific point so crucial?
Because, the sources argue, it directly tackles Russia's main stated security concern, the fear of NATO expansion right on its border, without leaving Ukraine vulnerable or cutting off military aid from NATO countries.
But how can Ukraine be secure without being in NATO?
The sources make a key point. NATO membership isn't just declared in a constitution. They use Finland as the prime example. For decades, Finland cooperated closely with NATO joint exercises, intelligence sharing, adopting NATO military standards, all before officially joining in 2023.
So Finlandization, but in a modern context. Secure partnerships without formal membership triggering Russia.
Exactly. Ukraine could have robust bilateral defense deals with NATO members, receive security guarantees, weapons, training, everything it needs without the formal Article 5 commitment that Russia sees as an existential threat. This removes Russia's core justification for the war, creating space for de-escalation.
Okay, that's step 1. What's step 2?
Step 2 involves India using its unique relationship with Moscow to work towards a ceasefire. But crucially, this ceasefire needs to be tied to phased security guarantees for both sides.
Phase guarantees. And why only India?
The sources are emphatic. Only India has the necessary trust and strategic depth with Moscow to even open that conversation. No other major power does right now. India is positioned as the only credible broker who could negotiate a ceasefire that lets Russia de-escalate without it looking like a total humiliation, offering reciprocal steps to build trust over time.
Okay. Step 3.
Step 3 is about building collective diplomatic muscle. India should form a coalition of neutral middle powers. Think Brazil, South Africa, maybe key ASEAN nations.
Why involve them?
To add weight and legitimacy. These countries aren't directly involved in the conflict. A united front from them, representing the global south, would create a powerful counterbalance to the existing blocs and add significant moral and diplomatic pressure for peace. It leverages that multipolar dynamic we discussed.
Using the collective strength of the non-aligned or middle ground nations. Makes sense. And the final step. Step 4.
Step 4 is the most concrete. India, potentially with its coalition partners, needs to help Ukraine table an actionable peace framework, not just vague principles, but concrete proposals.
Actionable proposals like what?
The sources get very specific here. They suggest Ukraine could propose referenda in all the disputed territories: Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and the occupied parts of Kherson, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia.
Referenda. What would people vote on?
Two clear options are suggested.
Sure.
Option one, remain within Ukraine, but as part of a new federal structure guaranteeing substantial autonomy, protecting linguistic and cultural rights for ethnic Russians, local control over things like policing and schools. Option two, independence, with the potential to then join the Russian Federation.
Wow, that puts the decision in the hands of the people living there.
Exactly. The sources stress this grants agency in Ukrainian hands. Kyiv sets the terms, Kyiv proposes the vote. It empowers Ukraine to offer a path forward.
And how does this compare to other potential peace ideas floating around, like that Trump-Putin map swap idea?
It's presented as a fundamental contrast. The map swap idea implies a backroom deal between great powers carving up territory over Ukraine's head. This referendum formula, however, puts the power squarely with the local populations.
And what does it do to Russia?
It forces Russia's hand. Either Moscow accepts the process, participates, and respects the outcome, thereby legitimizing it, or, if Russia rejects it, it exposes itself as unwilling to actually respect the popular will in those regions. It's a clever diplomatic move.
It sounds like strategic realism, trying to find a political off-ramp because the military one isn't there.
Precisely. The sources frame it as finding that point where political courage meets strategic necessity to actually end the war, rather than just manage its continuation.
This focus on a political solution, on diplomacy, it really highlights another theme in the sources, doesn't it? The basic idea that talking is better than fighting.
Yes, talking is better than shooting. That's one of the source headlines, and it's a core message. It sounds simple, maybe obvious, but in high-stakes geopolitics, it's presented as a vital strategic principle.
Oh, so?
They argue that direct dialogue between leaders, even deep adversaries, is almost always a better starting point than continuing conflict or relying solely on sanctions and threats.
And they mentioned the potential Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, scheduled for August 2025, apparently.
Yes, and they argue that regardless of personal opinions about the leaders, such a meeting should actually be welcomed. Why? Because it reduces the risk of miscalculation, a huge danger when tensions are high, and it opens doors for diplomacy that might otherwise stay shut.
Are there historical examples of this working?
Plenty. The sources cite the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy and Khrushchev's back-channel talks literally pulled the world back from nuclear war. Then there's the 1972 Nixon-Brezhnev Salt-I Treaty capping nuclear arms. Or the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Reykjavik in '86. It failed at the time, but paved the way for the INF Treaty later.
So face-to-face talks can break log jams.
They often can. The sources even mention Trump's meetings with Kim Jong-un. Controversial, yes, but they did undeniably lower the immediate temperature on the Korean peninsula at the time.
What is it about face-to-face meetings? Why are they potentially more effective than, say, sending messages through diplomats?
It's partly psychological, partly practical. Direct talks allow for clearer communication. You can read body language, build some level of personal rapport, even if minimal. Things get lost in translation through intermediaries.
You can gauge intentions better.
Perhaps, or at least clarify red lines more directly. The sources suggest months or years of sanctions and military posturing often achieve less than a few hours of direct, high-level conversation. It creates a different kind of space for potential understanding or compromise.
Okay, but these kinds of bilateral summits, especially between just two major powers like the US and Russia, they also face a lot of criticism, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely presented as a double-edged sword.
What are the main risks or criticisms?
The biggest concern, particularly from Ukraine and its allies, is that meeting without all the key stakeholders, especially Ukraine itself, risks legitimizing Russia's aggression. It could look like the big powers are deciding the fate of a smaller nation over their heads.
Undermining international norms, like sovereignty.
Exactly. It could send a signal that powerful nations can just bypass international law and carve up spheres of influence. There's a real fear of repeating historical mistakes.
Like Yalta in 1945, that's often mentioned.
Yes, that's the historical parallel. People worry about the great powers dividing Europe. From Kyiv's perspective, being excluded from such talks feels like a potential slow defeat, where concessions might be made without their input or consent. It creates a moral hazard, appearing to reward aggression.
Though it could look like Ukraine is just a pawn.
That's the danger, imposing a peace rather than negotiating one that respects Ukraine's agency.
And the ripple effects. Beyond just Ukraine.
There are worries it could damage alliance unity, especially NATO solidarity, if members feel the U.S. is cutting a separate deal. And there's the concern it might embolden other countries with territorial ambitions.
Like China regarding Taiwan.
That's often raised as a potential consequence. If great powers can settle disputes through bilateral deals that override sovereignty, what message does that send elsewhere?
The sources also mention this Trump-Vance factor.
Mm.
What's that about?
It refers to the combination of former President Trump's position, often described as ceasefire now, which many interpret as freezing the conflict in place, benefiting Russia, and VP J.D. Vance's suggestions that Europe should pay more for its own defense, implying less U.S. commitment.
How does that influence things?
Well, paradoxically, if KEFS perceives a significant shift in U.S. policy or commitment under a potential future administration, it might actually give them the political cover they need internally to recalibrate their own position, perhaps towards a negotiated settlement they previously resisted. It's complex.
Very complex. And this whole debate about summits, about sanctions, it seems to connect back to a broader critique in the sources about how the U.S., in particular, wields its global influence.
Yes, it does. It leads directly into an examination of what the sources see as flaws in how American power operates globally, linking it back to issues within the U.S. system itself.
Okay, so flaws in global influence linked to internal U.S. issues. How do the sources explain that?
They offer a pretty sharp critique of American democracy, focusing on structural aspects they see as, well, dysfunctional, particularly the U.S. Senate.
The Senate, how is that dysfunctional in their view?
They highlight how much structure gives disproportionate power to a very small percentage of the population, as low as 1%, they claim.
1%.
How? Through Senate representation. They use the classic example. California has almost 40 million people and gets 2 senators. Wyoming has fewer people than visit the Moon's Wikipedia page each month and also gets 2 senators.
Right, equal representation for states, not population.
Exactly. Which means senators representing a tiny fraction of the U.S. population can wield enormous power, blocking legislation, confirming appointments, approving treaties, influencing national and international policy.
And this imbalance is made worse by something else.
Yes, by what they call the money primary. The idea that long before any regular citizen votes, wealthy donors and powerful corporate lobbyists have already effectively filtered and narrowed down the field of viable presidential candidates through campaign contributions.
So money and structure concentrate power at the top.
That's the argument. They paint a picture of the Senate as this cooling chamber filled predominantly with older, wealthy white men who are somewhat detached from the pace of modern life.
Quoting obscure historical figures instead of governing for a digital age.
That's the kind of critique they level, suggesting the legislative process feels archaic, like using quill pens in candlelit rooms while the rest of the world is using AI. It's a strong image of a disconnect.
And how does this internal, let's call it quirkiness, impact America's global role?
The sources argue it directly affects America's ability to govern itself consistently and effectively, which then ripples outwards, impacting its global standing and policy reliability. If the system is internally skewed or gridlocked, how can it lead effectively abroad?
And this internal imbalance gets exported. How?
Through foreign policy tools, most notably sanctions. They draw a direct line from the structure of the Senate to the imposition of global sanctions.
Wait, how does that work?
The argument is that the same small group of senators, representing that potentially tiny fraction of the U.S. population, are the ones signing off on sanctions that try to dictate the economic behavior of billions of people around the world in China, India, Russia, elsewhere.
So a tiny, unrepresentative group legislating for the planet.
That's exactly how the sources put it. 1% of America's population attempting to legislate for the rest of the planet is, in the most literal sense, undemocratic. It's a direct challenge to the legitimacy of that process.
And the effect of these sanctions, wielded by what they call the least globally accountable lawmakers.
They argue it turns sanctions into a blunt instrument. Instead of careful, targeted diplomacy, you get these broad measures that often generate global resentment, push targeted countries to find workarounds, and ultimately erode long-term U.S. influence.
Workarounds like de-dollarization.
Exactly. Developing alternative payment systems, trading in other currencies, building parallel economic structures, all things that weaken the U.S.-led system over time. The sanctions become more about moral grandstanding, the sources suggest, than effective statecraft.
So again, strategic self-harm on a global scale.
That's the underlying theme. Actions driven by internal U.S. political structures end up undermining U.S. interests abroad and potentially fracturing the global economic order. They contrast this with China, noting that Beijing doesn't pretend otherwise about the role of money and power in its system. A cynical, but maybe more transparent approach.
Okay, so if the current system of sanctions driven by these internal dynamics is flawed and military options are often dead ends, what's the alternative vision for global leadership or problem solving?
The sources propose something pretty radical, almost startlingly simple, yet revolutionary in its implications.
Which is
Direct, live-streamed summits between the key world leaders.
live streamed. You mean like put Trump, Putin, Xi, Modi, Zelensky all in a room together,
Yeah.
turn on the cameras and let the world watch.
Basically, yes. They call it C-SPAN goes global. Raw, unfiltered dialogue. No aides whispering in their ears, no off-camera spin, no carefully pre-negotiated statements.
Wow, that sounds potentially chaotic.
Messy, certainly. But the argument is it could be far more constructive than the endless cycles of sanctions and military posturing we see now, which haven't delivered lasting peace.
How would that transparency change things?
That's the key question. Would removing the usual diplomatic filters and backroom maneuvering force a different kind of interaction? Maybe more accountability, maybe more directness.
Could it foster actual understanding even between adversaries if they have to speak directly, publicly?
It's a provocative idea. Could it shift diplomacy away from opaque deals towards something more like public engagement and direct responsibility? It suggests radical transparency might be the most powerful tool when trust is low and the stakes are incredibly high.
This all seems to loop back then to India's position in this changing world. All these shifts, these critiques,
Yeah.
they create an opening.
A huge opportunity, the sources argue, but also a responsibility. They stress again, multipolarity isn't automatic, it has to be actively managed.
And the danger for India isn't being ignored anymore.
No, the risk now, they say, isn't irrelevance, it's complacency. Just showing up isn't enough.
What does active management mean then?
It means not just attending the summits, but shaping the agendas. Not just signing trade deals someone else wrote, but designing the rules, embedding your own norms and interests into the system.
Moving from being a rule taker to a rule maker.
Precisely. Shifting from being a recipient of global norms to being a creator of them. That's what being a true pole implies.
Where could India focus this kind of leadership? What areas?
The possibilities are wide. Maybe reshaping global trade rules to be fairer to developing nations. Maybe leading on new climate frameworks, or setting standards for digital governance, AI ethics. It requires vision and active engagement.
And this active leadership, it's not just about India protecting its own narrow interests.
No, it connects back to the core argument. If India only focuses on reacting to Washington or Beijing, it misses the bigger chance to shape the entire multipolar era for everyone.
But if it engages broadly,
If it engages broadly with the big powers, the middle economies, those smaller states we talked about, then it can do more than just protect itself. It can actually lead.
because the power lies in connecting the poles.
That's the concluding thought from one source. In a system with many poles, power belongs to those who connect them. In a fragmented world, being the connector, the bridge builder, is where true influence lies.
So the question isn't US or China or Russia anymore.
No, the real question for India, the sources argue, is whether it can ally with all of them and 100 others on its own terms. Playing and, not or.
And if India succeeds in this, what could that mean for the world order?
It could potentially foster a more stable, maybe more equitable system, one where power is more genuinely distributed, where cooperation is based on mutual interest, not rigid ideology, and where more nations have a real voice. Success would look like a truly multipolar world, managed collaboratively, not dominated by one or two players.
Okay, so that's a lot for you, our listener, to think about. Let's try to recap the key takeaways from this deep dive.
We started with that fundamental shift, the move to a multipolar world, and why India's strategy needs to be about playing and, not or, connecting with everyone.
Right. And then India's unique potential to lead smaller nations, the G77, leveraging that collective weight. We also unpacked those U.S. trade tensions, arguing they're more about internal U.S. lobbies, agriculture, pharma, than just personality politics.
Then we moved to Ukraine, the argument that a military solution is a mirage and that sanctions designed to force one are often strategic self-harm.
Highlighting the need for a political path, and India's unique potential, maybe responsibility, to broker peace, using that detailed four-step playbook, non-NATO security, ceasefire talks, a coalition, and those referenda.
Absolutely. Which led us to the broader case for direct diplomacy. Talking is better than shooting, even with its risks. And the critique of how U.S. internal structures, like the Senate, can export dysfunction through things like sanctions.
And that radical idea of C-SPAN goes global, transparent leader summits,
Hmm.
all leading back to India's choice. Complacency or actively managing multipolarity, shaping agendas, designing rules.
It really paints a picture of global power shifting dramatically.
Yeah.
And it forces you to think about how internal politics shape external actions, and how a proactive, nuanced strategy like the one outlined for India could genuinely reshape things for decades. It's about moving towards a more interconnected, maybe messier, but potentially more balanced world.
So that leaves us with our final provocative thought for you to mull over. If, as these sources suggest, lasting peace isn't found in economic self-sabotage or great powers carving up maps in secret,
And if wars really do end, only when political courage meets strategic necessity.
then what active political steps could any rising power, maybe one you follow closely, maybe your own country, realistically take today to truly redefine a conflict? Not just contain it, but change its fundamental dynamics.
And thinking about that multipolar method, what specific contradictions or internal fault lines within today's major global players could potentially be leveraged subtly and ethically to nudge things towards a more peaceful, more beneficial outcome for everyone? How can those internal pressure points become diplomatic opportunities?
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.